Search. I recently set up a new bookcase for my toddler. He loves turning the pages and showing.
Here are the current weather conditions as issued by Environment Canada. Northwest at 11 kilometers an hour. Wind chill -33, and Dawson Creek clear minus.
Human culture, you can see things like we evolved modern electoral democracy for the first time. There were huge social and political emancipation movements. There was a knowledge revolution, an explosion of scientific knowledge and technological invention, breakthroughs in all sorts of areas: history, philosophy, linguistics, particle physics, genetics, nanotechnology, and so on. All happening since mass literacy. Now, that's not conclusive evidence, but is it really coincidence?
Piano.
Telling the future is a notoriously dangerous thing to engage in. I'm very hesitant. But if we let our reading habits decline the way we have done in the well, couple of decades, healthy diet. As a very part of our daily lives, and there's no reason to stop that. What we're heading for is an imbalanced. Reading is taking second position. Like the idea that we can ourselves, and while we make ourselves, to practice our thinking.
Premiere-athon launch party this weekend only at the great North.
I was in a classroom, and one of the assignments required students to sort of independently think of some possible answers to a question, and it wasn't graded. It was a very safe assignment. And when we looked at the answers that students had submitted, it was clear that a large number of these answers had been generated by an AI model. And one thing that really broke my heart was I had a student, one of the most intellectually engaged students in the course, which you could tell by their interactions during the class. This was someone who was clearly intellectual and clearly. And this to me afterwards, an answer. Because I think I had more interesting things to say, and I'd written it, and I looked at it, and I didn't trust myself. Or maybe just too weird, or just too, maybe they weren't relevant, maybe they weren't right. So I went back and asked them to use that to trim out anything that didn't fit what the AI model gave me. And I really wish I hadn't done that. And I just walked away from that interaction thinking, oh, we're in trouble, right? Because this student is just one of many. And this student was a very good student and one with a lot of promise, the kind of student that we expect to be able to see great things from. And they're already leaning on this system that they don't need, which is ultimately diminishing their creativity and diminishing their confidence. Because this is a student who would have been much more bold in their thinking before a tool like this was available to them.
For Shannon Ballard, thinking well is to some extent about creativity. And creativity requires more than just time and cognitive patience. It also requires confidence.
I use the example of mountain climbing. So if you think about how you build confidence as a mountain climber, how do you get up the mountain? Well, the mountain climber does that through a process of trial and error that has real stakes. And by encountering a mountain that does not mold itself to their attempts. So the slippery part of the mountain doesn't make itself easier when you encounter difficulty. You have to get better in order to climb it. Now, compare that with trying to work through something of intellectual difficulty with a chatbot. The problem is that these chatbots will mold themselves in their answers to you, and they will accommodate your cognitive limits in ways that will induce a false sense of confidence. Confidence. If a person has a confidence that they can jump off a roof and fly, that's not something we want them to have, right?
I wanted to ask what you make of the contention that these tools could alter our confidence in our own ability as a reader and a thinker, could limit our belief in what we're capable of thinking on our own.
Well, with good reason. We should have no confidence if we haven't built up a thinking apparatus. That's the correct assumption. In the last year, there have been these studies, one by a group from Microsoft, on workers who are using AI and those who are using only their own critical judgment to make decisions. And what you see is very simple. If they think that they're going to do it using AI, they don't use their more critical analytic processes. Now, that's one study that's very basic for, I'd say, the average adult. But then there's an MIT graduate student study in which the students were given ChatGPT or not to write an essay. And the students who used ChatGPT compared to the others had different brain activation patterns, but very importantly and very simply, they couldn't remember a single sentence they had written themselves. This is a Sherry Turkle at MIT. We do not transgress when we innovate. We transgress when we do not allow ourselves to examine what an innovation will disrupt or destroy. And that's what I think about with ChatGPT. What are we disrupting? What are we destroying potentially in its development?
If we have reading done for us, we minimize the number of occasions to figure out, well, what do I think? What do I feel? Why does this matter to me? How does this connect up with other parts of my life? If I read one thing, does it spur me to read something else? Because if I haven't read it, I'm not going to have an occasion to be so spurred.
There's a section in Naomi Barron's book, Readerbot, that I've been thinking about a lot. In it, she describes how students are relying on generative AI to write their admissions essays in an effort to optimize their odds of getting into their preferred school. And it becomes this vicious cycle because admissions officers are increasingly also using AI to read the incoming applications. At some point, you have to step back and ask, what exactly are we trying to do here? What's the best case you could make right now to someone who's, in a university class and doesn't want to write their own essay, wants to use an AI language model to do it?
I mean, in kind of the traditions of my debate group, I wouldn't start with an argument, I would start with a question, which is, why don't you drop the class?
Well, what if their answer to your question is they need the grade, to get the degree, and they need the degree to get a job, and it's just as simple as that?
It's lame though, right? I think there's that question of what parts of your thinking are good to delegate to someone else and what parts have to be thunk for yourself. And I use Claude for things like, in the past week, trying to figure out if I should bring a sick kid into the pediatrician. And Claude can kind of be an approximation of what does a typical pediatrician say to these symptoms. And I both don't want to start from the beginning and acquire all the knowledge a pediatrician has, but I also don't want to take off work and pull my kid out of school to see the real pediatrician. Come back later. But when it comes to the conversations I have with my kids, when they ask me big questions or little questions, we talk a lot about Julius Caesar in my house, much more than preschoolers typically do, because my husband is a high school teacher, and his kids staged Julius Caesar last year.
I come to praise Caesar, not to praise him.
So my kids have lots of questions about tyranny and friendship and loyalty, and I don't want to direct any of those questions to an AI, because I don't want them to receive the median person's approximation of whether Julius Caesar was a tyrant. I want my kids to have the space to think through some of the questions for themselves, and I also want them to hear my answers in particular and make this part of our connection.
What ends up happening is, on the one hand, you save an incredible amount of time by having an AI do the reading for you, but it also obviates the need or the opportunity for you to read yourself. What's happening now in the world of science, and I understand the rationale for it, is people are relying on various tools to, number one, locate what articles might be of interest on a particular topic, to do whatever the researcher asks for, to summarize each article, to compare them, to write a summary, to do a kind of meta-analysis across the articles. And it does a really interesting job in that it looks quite impressive. But what gets eliminated is the perspective of the researcher. We're treating research as if it's an system. So you put your coin in the slot, and then the research comes out. It's individual researchers who stop and think, wait a second, is that true? Or, you know what? This sparks something in my mind that's not actually in the article, but reading this article makes me think about whatever it happens to be. And that is what's getting lost when we have, in this case, in the research world, when we have our research pre-digested for us. And I understand the importance of not missing things that might be important. But you know what? We're going to miss things anyway. Whether we use AI Science Direct or whether we do it ourselves, we're going to miss some things. But we're also going to have the opportunity, if we say, I'm doing this, at least some of it the old-fashioned way. You know, I'll go for 50-50. We have the opportunity to be an individual scientist, an individual explorer, an individual human mind.
50-50 might seem like a reasonable bargain, but it's unclear how many people will take Naomi up on it now that generative AI is offering up a sort of intellectual moving sidewalk, ready to take us from A to B without all the mental steps.
You know, it's very hard to opt out of this fast-moving world in which we think we have no time to engage in reflection, to engage in deeper thought. We think there is so much going on that we need to keep track of, and you know, it's very easy to ditch habits like reading because they are so demanding. So you can't really blame individuals, is perhaps what I'm trying to say. You know, it's not up to individuals to say, now I've got to make a stand, I've got to force myself to think more. It would be great if we all could, but it's so easy not to. So you know, that is a task that we confront as a society rather than as individuals.
Are you trying to put the apple in the toothbrush holder?
Yeah.
I want to ask you about the time piece of the equation here because, you know, we're all very busy. We're busy folk, right? How much of the problem here is that modern life just doesn't give us the time to do this anymore?
I completely agree with the assumption that we are too busy and that we don't have time. I disagree in that we don't have to be like that. And that is, I think we should have more priority given to the quality of what we experience, not the quantity that we so, in our culture, so rapaciously value as efficiency. It's a rapacious appetite for efficiency that I believe is a part of the problem. We can't experience the present because we have got this efficiency principle, so we're moving from one experience to the next. And so we are not experiencing anything at the level that would make life, I think, have more quality. If there's any group of people that I would excuse from this, it's the young parents. But everybody else, I say, prioritize.
Sweetie, did you make a mess?
Yeah.
It's nice to be let off the hook, especially by Marianne Wolf, but I don't think I'll take her up on it. I'd rather take a lesson from the way children engage with the world, particularly when it comes to what Leah Sargent calls the friction of thinking. Kids have a near infinite patience for this sometimes, where my son, we were visiting a friend who has a little step down into their living room, and he's just learning about how to get down a step by himself. So if he was ignoring a room full of toys, just climb up the step.
and then try and step down again and again and again. And the reason he was drawn to it was because it was hard for him. I think my job as a mother is to help my kids hold on to the sense that that feeling of friction is the sign you're near somewhere you can grow, and how to calibrate, well, what amount of difficulty, what kind of hurt is the wrong kind of hurt, but that excitement, even when there are adults who otherwise might rest on what feels easy and what feels comfortable. When things are difficult, the right amount of difficult for you, something exciting could be about to happen. And I think that's something adults don't believe very often, that adults try and find the areas where they have mastery and where things are easier or finding a flow state, and that once you hit friction, it's a sign you've hit the domain you're not very good at, and therefore you want to back off.
Like any challenging accomplishment, climbing steps included, reading and thinking have to be maintained.
If we do not maintain, if you forget how to read at that deep level, if you are no longer able to be immersed in reading, you will slowly but surely and imperceptibly atrophy the reading brain circuit. It's like any skill. It won't disappear. You know, that's what's so deceptive. It'll be there. You'll feel like you can read and that you're getting the gist of the information, but will you have those feelings that allow you to activate your own best thoughts, that's Proust, or that will give you a chance to have a more empathic understanding of others? You don't give it time, you don't get the reward.
Shannon Valor, our schools, our institutions, our workplaces are all about metrics, are all about the tests, all about the benchmarks, all about ensuring conformity to an external standard that we use to measure whether the school is successful, to measure whether our children are successful. So this, this long process of turning education into an exercise in producing test scores as opposed to expanding minds, or the way we've turned the workforce into a system for producing people who will see themselves as maximally efficient and optimizing machines for generating outputs, instead of people collectively engaged in meaningful labor. We've already primed people to use these tools in ways that will mechanize their thinking and diminish their creativity. So it's not just the tool itself, it's the tool plus the incentives, it's the tool plus the values that we have promoted unwisely, I think, over the last few decades, where we have been trying to turn our children, trying to turn ourselves into maximally efficient machines. And so it should be no surprise now that we've built machines that will speed up that process, we imagine.
You use this metaphor in your book of AI as a mirror, and it raises the question, this analogy of AI as a mirror, of what thoughts exactly these mirrors are or aren't reflecting back to us.
We know, of course, that the mirror is not reflecting the thoughts of all of humanity, and certainly not representing the thoughts of humanity in any kind of neutral way. What gets fed into these models, the light that falls on them, if you will, comes from the sources of digitized data that large AI platform companies had access to. And that is all of the material that they scraped off of the internet primarily. And we know that the internet doesn't reflect everyone equally. So we see that machine learning models reflect back to us thoughts that represent historical majorities, people who have had disproportionate access to the internet, and people who have had the social privilege to have their thoughts recorded and transmitted to future generations.
It's also profoundly backward-looking in a way. How does that create limitations for it as a tool for human thought?
That's the thing that I think worries me the most in the long term about how we are using these tools. There are absolutely legitimate uses for large language models, but increasingly people are using them as substitutes for human thought and decision making. We're using them to offload our own cognitive responsibilities. The problem with that is that all that these models can do is analyze the patterns of the thoughts we've already had. And so whenever we rely on these tools to then generate new decisions, or new art, or new code, what we're doing is ensuring that those same patterns are extended into the future.
Our world is tremendously complex. We should not forget that. We've created that world in which we've had a knowledge revolution, and it's still going on, but the complexity that results from it is unbelievable. And we need to somehow deal with that complexity and the challenges that it creates. Think of all the problems that humanity is facing yourself. Then perhaps we need the discipline. We need to work on our capacity to think just to survive.
Think about what humans do when we make great leaps forward in art, or in politics, or in science. Often, those great leaps forward are moments where we break from the patterns of the past and we create a pattern that we've never seen before, a pattern that never existed before, but that our minds have put together in a new way. And that kind of creativity is at risk of being lost if instead we turn all of our productive, artistic, and cognitive capability over to machines that are designed to regenerate the patterns that the model has already seen. So we've got this rhetoric that AI is the future, that AI is the window through which we build better worlds. But in fact, I think AI is something that threatens to eat the future by simply reproducing the past and putting it where the future should be.
The future is very top of mind for me because I have a 18-month-old at home. He's just starting to use his language to express himself.
No.
We spent a lot of time reading books together.
Oh, that's great.
And so I do think a lot about the world that he's going to grow up in and the world of thinking that I want him to inhabit as he grows. So, there's this fundamental question of why do we think at all? What is thinking for? And I guess the last thing I want to ask you is how can we reestablish the importance, the value of learning and then of thinking in a world, as you describe, that's so tuned toward efficiency and ease?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question, and I think it comes down to learning to recover and reclaim the joy that we find in thinking. So that's something that I find a lot of my students who have been in very high-pressured educational environments for their whole lives have either lost touch with or never been given the privilege of taking pleasure in thinking. Because it's always been a task, it's always been something where the most important thing is that they not fail, where the most important thing is that they meet the standard. And I think the most important thing about thinking is what a tremendous source of joy it can be.
Where do you find the most joy in thinking?
I find a lot of joy in reading fiction. And I think another thing that allows me to remain connected to the joy of thinking is conversation with other people who don't already share my point of view. A lot of times you say, yeah, I'm really interested in this thing. And then they just look at you like, what? Why would you be interested in that? That sounds incredibly boring, or I have no idea what you're talking about. And then suddenly you have this incentive to articulate what it is that's fascinating about this weird little hobby that you have, or what it is that's exciting about this new book or this new TV show that you're into. And so you start telling this story, and you start finding in your own thoughts the source of that value, because you're trying to communicate it to somebody else. And then they're trying to do the same for you. And so it's in the friction of conversation with other people that we discover new, pleasurable, artistic, and intellectual horizons. And that's something that I think we need to reclaim as well. And so if you have children, find ways to help them take pleasure in intellectual exploration, where it's not about the pressure to succeed, where it's not about the fear of failure. And if you don't have kids, think about how you can recover that joy for yourself, because I think a lot of us are in work environments where we're not allowed to explore new horizons, where we're not allowed to take intellectual risks, where we're not allowed to sit and reflect and ponder about where we might go next, where it's always about pressuring us to perform like a machine. So if we can back away from that and recover the source of joy in thinking, then I think we can find the reasons to resist harmful uses of AI and rebuild the intellectual foundations for a creative and wise and enjoyable way of life.
Should we read this book about the two polar bears?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I play this
Polar bears. Can you see polar bears?
one?
That's right.
And it's been a joy thinking about all that. This documentary about the art of thinking is from Ideas producer Annie
Do
Bender.
you see the birds?
Yeah.
Ideas is a broadcast and a podcast. If you like the episode you just heard, check out our vast archive, where you can find more than 300 of our past episodes.
Should we turn the page?
Yeah.
Technical production, Sam McNulty and Emily Carvazio. Our web producer is Lisa.
See that?
Now we're gonna play.
Bye.
This is CBC Radio 1, 88.3 FM in Fort St. John.
The Paralympic Winter Games Milano Cortina 2026 are almost here, and it all lives on CBC and CBC Gem. Access every Paralympic moment, all for free. Live streams and full replays, CBC Gem puts you in control of the events you want to watch. Get ready for Air Ice Hockey.
Prices combined with an out-of-control federal immigration policies are together driving unsustainable budget deficits, not just here, but across the country.
We get more from Aaron Collins in Calgary. No surprise energy prices are impacting Alberta's bottom line. Part of the problem, they always are. The province significantly overestimated what the price of oil would be last year, but the Premier says falling revenues aren't the only issue. Smith also blamed the federal government's immigration policies under Justin Trudeau for skyrocketing expenses in Alberta.
The fact is, Alberta taxpayers can no longer be asked to continue to subsidize the entire country through equalization and federal transfers permit the federal government to flood our borders with new arrivals, and then give free access to our most generous in the country social programs to anyone who moves here.
Smith says 600,000 more people came to Alberta in just the past 5 years, and the Premier says there's just no way the province can support that kind of growth. Aaron Collins, CBC News, Calgary.
In public office. He's accused of sharing confidential government information with the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Andrew's arrest is renewing calls for accountability in the U.S. and has many asking, what's taking so long? Paul Hunter has more from Washington.
We won't stop. On word that former Prince Andrew had been arrested, Sky Roberts, brother of the late Virginia Giuffre, the woman who'd accused Andrew of sexual assault, says the family feels
friends in Canada. So thankful to have you aboard in the many stations that we air our program on in Canada. I've been saying this recently to the benefit of our Canadian listeners, that we want you to know that Canada supports Canada, which means when you give a gift in Canada, it goes to the support of the Canadian ministry. It doesn't come across the border into the United States. Canada is a self-supporting Turning Point ministry, which means when you give to Canada's radio and television ministry from Turning Point, you're supporting your own nation, your own listeners.
He's in Washington on Thursday. Cameron McIntosh has the details.
Palestinians were not among the representatives of nearly 50 nations sketching out a vision for Gaza's future.
Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Uzbekistan, and Kuwait have all contributed more than $7 billion.
That money to help fund sweeping plans for a demilitarized and reconstructed Gaza. 5 countries say they'll contribute troops to an international security force to keep the peace, as a local police force is trained, with Gaza to be run day to day by a group of Palestinian technocrats. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair is an executive on the board.
It remains the best, indeed the only hope for Gaza, the region, and the wider world.
Trump says that includes a non-nuclear Iran, threatening it to make a deal in 10 to 15 days or face military action. Cameron McIntosh, CBC News, Jerusalem.
Eric Dane, the actor best known for his roles on Grey's Anatomy and Euphoria, has died following his battle with Lou Gehrig's disease. Last April, Dane publicly disclosed that he had been diagnosed with the disease. Eric Dane was 53 years old. And that is the world this hour. For CBC News, I'm Neil Kumar.
And now the BC forecast on the north coast. Periods of snow Friday with a high of 3. Highs around minus 15 with light snow in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George.
If anyone ever thinks they're educated and that makes them a candidate for pride, they just need to go back and think about the statistics I just shared. Solomon tells us that when we have true wisdom, and every day we have to get up.
His latest album, Best of Our Possible Lives. All of it, plus the power of having altered.
For an evil thing, for he does whatever he pleases. And who may say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful.
I'm an enemy.